He thought he could silence her with handcuffs, until she stood before the judge and exposed his corruption for all to see. The Texas night stretched endlessly, its silence broken only by the low hum of an engine rolling over smooth asphalt. The highway was mostly empty, save for the occasional glow of headlights flickering in the distance. It was late, just past 11 p.m., the hour when most people just want to get home. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Carter was one of them. 2 hours behind the wheel, exhaustion gnawed at the edges of her mind, but her grip on the wheel remained steady. She wasn't in uniform tonight, just a plain black sweater, jeans, and sneakers. Her dark curls were tied back in a simple ponytail. To anyone passing by, she looked like an ordinary woman heading home after a long day. And that was exactly how she liked it. Soft jazz whispered through her car speakers, filling the quiet space with familiar warmth. She tapped her fingers against the wheel, following the rhythm, trying to shake off the stiffness creeping into her shoulders. Just a few more miles, then bed, then peace. But then, flashing lights, red and blue strobes danced in her rearview mirror, cutting through the darkness like a blade. Naomi's stomach clenched, not out of fear, but something heavier. Frustration. She sighed, already knowing how this was going to play out. Not again. She had been stopped before. Not often. Not for any real reason. And never by a cop who had an actual, legitimate concern. She knew the drill too well. Her hands instinctively went to 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. No sudden movements. No reaching. Just controlled, deliberate stillness. The patrol car pulled up behind her, its engine grumbling low as the driver's side door creaked open. Heavy boots hit the pavement. The officer took his time, long enough to make sure she noticed. Naomi inhaled through her nose, slow and steady. This wasn't new. She flicked on her hazard lights as a courtesy. The road ahead was empty, no witnesses. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she pushed the irritation down. The officer finally reached her window. Bang! The sharp rap of knuckles against glass made her flinch. Naomi turned her head slowly, her eyes locking onto the figure looming outside. The streetlight above flickered, casting uneven shadows across his face. Sergeant Lucas Hayes. He was white, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, arrogant stance. His uniform was neat, badge-polished, but his eyes, those eyes, held the kind of entitlement that sent a chill down her spine. He didn't greet her, didn't introduce himself. Instead, he barked, license and registration. Naomi didn't move right away. She let the moment hang in the air, studying him. Then, with calm precision, she asked, "What's the reason for the stop?" Lucas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he smirked, shifting his weight like a man who enjoyed stretching his power. Then came the lie. Tail lights out. Naomi's brow furrowed. That couldn't be right. She had her car serviced just last month. Everything had checked out fine. The air changed. Power. Resistance. A silent battle waged in the seconds that followed. Naomi knew exactly what this was. And Lucas Hayes had no idea who he had just pulled over. Naomi kept her breath steady, her gaze unwavering as she looked up at Sergeant Lucas Hayes. She had dealt with men like him before, ones who wore their authority like armor, convinced it made them invincible. "Tail lights out," he had said. A lie. But this wasn't about a broken tail light. It never was. She exhaled through her nose, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Are you sure, officer?" she asked. "Because my car was inspected last month. Everything checked out fine." Lucas's eyes narrowed slightly. The smirk tugging at his lips faltered, just for a second, before it returned. "Ma'am, I didn't ask for your opinion. I asked for your license and registration." His voice had a practiced impatience, a tone meant to deter questioning. Naomi had been in high-pressure situations before. She had commanded troops, led operations, made split-second decisions under fire. But right now, she was just a black woman sitting in her car, staring up at a man who didn't expect her to push back. And she could feel it, the moment he realized she wasn't afraid. She reached over slowly, deliberately, opening her glove compartment. She kept her movements controlled, because she knew how this could go wrong in an instant. Her fingers brushed against the edge of her registration, and she pulled it out along with her ID. With practiced caution, she handed them over. Lucas snatched the papers from her hand, barely glancing at them before stepping back. She waited. A beat passed, then another. His eyes flickered between her ID and her face. His smirk returned. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Carter. It wasn't a question. It was a taunt. Something in his tone told her that he recognized the rank, but didn't care. She didn't respond. He took a slow step forward, tucking her ID into his pocket instead of handing it back. Step out of the car. Naomi didn't move. Here it was. The escalation she knew was coming. She should have seen it earlier. The subtle stiffness in his stance, the way he took his time, the way he had already decided how this encounter was going to end. Still, she gave him the chance. Is there a reason? She asked. Her voice measured. Lucas's jaw tightened. His hand dropped to his belt, just over his holster. Not a direct threat, but close enough to make statement. He didn't repeat himself. Instead, he lifted his radio to his lips, pressing the button with intentional slowness. Dispatch, I got a non-compliant driver here. Naomi felt it then. The shift in power, the way he was setting the stage. The moment he said those words, he wasn't just a cop pulling over a driver. He was a man ensuring that if anything went wrong, it would be blamed on her. She had two choices. Comply, let him win, or push back and risk escalation. Naomi reached for the door handle, keeping her face neutral as she stepped out. The night air was cooler than she expected. The pavement was still damp from the evening drizzle, reflecting the neon glow of the distant city skyline. She stood tall, shoulders squared, not aggressive, but not submissive either. Lucas took one slow step closer, sizing her up. Turn around. Hands on the car. Naomi didn't move. For what reason? She asked. Lucas's smirk disappeared. Are you resisting? His tone was dangerous now, coiled like a snake, waiting for an excuse to strike. Naomi could feel her pulse steadying, her heartbeat even. She had been trained for moments like this, to keep her mind clear, to measure every response. But she also knew men like him didn't need a reason. And that's when he decided. Without warning, he grabbed her wrist and twisted it behind her back. Pain shot up her arm as he wrenched her forward, slamming her chest against the side of her car. The sharp click of metal filled the air. Handcuffs. Too tight. Intentional. Naomi inhaled through clenched teeth, forcing her body not to tense. You're under arrest, Lucas said casually, as if it were a foregone conclusion. Naomi turned her head slightly, her cheek pressing against the cool metal of the car door. For what? She asked, her voice steady. Lucas grinned, shoving her wrists up higher, just to hear her suck in a sharp breath. Obstruction, he said. And since you're so fond of arguing, let's call it resisting arrest too. He grabbed her elbow, yanking her off the car, then started shoving her toward the patrol vehicle. Naomi stumbled, but caught herself before she could fall. Her muscles burned, her wrists throbbed against the metal cuffs, but she kept her expression unreadable. Lucas was enjoying this. He was relishing the fact that no matter what she said, he was in control. Naomi let out a slow breath, her military training kicking in. Stay calm. Stay alert. She wasn't about to give him what he wanted. As he reached for the back door of the police cruiser, she spoke again. You don't know what you're doing. Lucas chuckled. Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing. The back door of the cruiser swung open, and Naomi knew this was only the beginning. The patrol car door slammed shut, enclosing Naomi in a space that felt too small, too cold, too quiet. She sat still, her back pressed against the hard plastic seat, her wrists aching from the handcuffs that Lucas had purposely tightened too much. Outside, the glow of the streetlights flickered against the darkened windows. The hum of the car's idling engine filled the silence, broken only by the distant sound of tires rolling over wet pavement. Lucas climbed into the driver's seat, whistling like he didn't have a care of the world. He adjusted his rearview mirror, catching Naomi's reflection. Most people just shut up when I pull them over, he sneered, tapping his fingers against the wheel. Naomi didn't respond. She wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she sat motionless, her breathing measured, her face unreadable. She had learned long ago that men like him fed off reactions. The angrier you got, the smugger they became. The more you fought back, the harder they pushed. So she wouldn't fight. Not here. Not now. Lucas waited a beat, expecting a response. When none came, he scoffed under his breath and threw the car into gear. The patrol car lurched forward, pulling away from the side of the road. the blue and red lights still flashing against the darkened asphalt. Naomi shifted slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight, deliberately so. She turned her head slightly, her gaze settling on the dashboard camera. Was it recording? She couldn't tell. Lucas was the type to conveniently turn off his body cam if things got too messy. But the dashboard camera? That was harder to manipulate. If it was on, it would have caught everything. The way he yanked her out of the car, the way he twisted the cuffs, the way he escalated the situation without cause. Naomi sat back, filing that thought away. Every detail mattered. The car ride was eerily quiet, save for the occasional flicker of static from Lucas's radio. Then, so, he said casually, breaking the silence. What's it like, being all high and mighty in the Navy? Naomi didn't answer. Lucas smirked, drumming his fingers against the wheel. Bet you thought that would matter, huh? He mused. Bet you thought I'd back off if I saw that little rank of yours on your ID. Naomi exhaled slowly through her nose. Lucas chuckled, shaking his head. Yeah, that's what I thought. The road stretched ahead, empty, lifeless. The police station was still a few miles away, but Naomi could already picture it. The fluorescent lights, the dead-eyed officers, the cold steel bars waiting at the end of the booking process. She had never been on this side of the law before, and she knew this wasn't just about her. This was about power. And Lucas Hayes? He was drunk on it. The patrol car pulled into a near-empty parking lot, the bright white glow of the station's overhead lights casting long, eerie shadows against the pavement. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, taking in the gray, lifeless building ahead. It was cold, unwelcoming, and utterly indifferent. Lucas parked in a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned in his seat. Time for the fun part, he said, flashing a grin. Naomi stayed silent as he got out, slamming the door shut behind him. A second later, her door swung open. Rough hands gripped her arm, pulling her out of the back seat. Naomi bit back a wince, refusing to let him see the discomfort in her face. Lucas led her up the concrete steps, his grip on her firm but unnecessary. She wasn't resisting. She hadn't resisted once, but he wanted to make a point. Inside, the station was just as she expected. Bright overhead lighting, dull-colored walls, and officers who didn't even glance up as she was brought in. Routine. That's what this was to them. The desk sergeant barely looked up from his paperwork as Lucas guided her toward the booking area. Who we got? The sergeant asked, flipping through forms without interest. Lucas shrugged casually. Just another one who thought the rules didn't apply to her. The sergeant didn't even glance in Naomi's direction. His indifference was infuriating. Lucas nudged her forward. You know the drill. She did, and she hated that she did. The mugshot, the fingerprints, the cold, mechanical process of turning a person into a case file. Lucas leaned against the counter, watching with lazy amusement as the booking officer processed her paperwork. Naomi remained quiet, her mind working in the background, and that's when she noticed it. Lucas was too relaxed. He wasn't writing up the paperwork himself. He wasn't logging the arrest properly, and that could mean only one thing. This wasn't the first time he'd done something like this. Naomi kept her face neutral, but inside, the realization burned. He had done this before. How many others had sat in this exact chair, been through this exact process, because Lucas Hayes decided they didn't belong? Her jaw tightened slightly, but she forced her shoulders to remain loose. She wasn't just going to sit here and let this happen. Not to her. Not anyone else. Lucas sighed dramatically, checking his watch. You know, this could have been easier if you just followed directions. Naomi lifted an eyebrow, finally breaking her silence. You mean if I didn't question you? Lucas's smirk widened. Exactly. Naomi let out a slow breath, sitting back in the chair. Lucas didn't realize it yet, but his arrogance, it was about to be his downfall. The metal bars slid shut with a dull clang, sealing Naomi inside the cold, dimly lit holding cell. She didn't move right away. Instead, she simply sat down on the narrow metal bench, resting her hands on her lap, her breathing slow and measured. Her wrists still ached from the too tight handcuffs. The sharp red marks on her skin stood out against the harsh fluorescent light overhead. But she wasn't thinking about that. She was assessing. The cell was small and sparse, just a bench, a stainless steel toilet in the corner, and 4 walls of concrete and bars. She had spent nights in worse conditions. She had been in situations where she had to survive on nothing but instinct and training. This wasn't survival. This was a game, and Naomi Carter knew how to play it. She leaned back against the wall, her eyes half-lidded, looking relaxed even though her mind was anything but. Her training had taught her to read a situation, to see what wasn't immediately visible. And right now, she was piecing together the truth about Sergeant Lucas Hayes. This wasn't his first time doing this. She could see it in the way the other officers barely reacted, in the lack of paperwork, in the way the booking process had been handled like routine. He had done this before. To how many? She thought about the stories she had heard over the years. Black men and women arrested over minor infractions. Their lives derailed by a corrupt system. Their names forgotten because they didn't have the resources to fight back. But Naomi wasn't them. She had the training, the rank, the connections. She wasn't helpless. And Lucas had no idea who he had just messed with. Footsteps, heavy boots, thudding against tile. Naomi didn't have to look up to know who it was. She could feel it. The arrogance. The false confidence. Lucas Hayes. The bars rattled slightly as he stopped in front of the cell, arms crossed over his chest. His smirk was back. It was the kind of smirk a man wears when he thinks he's untouchable. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. Naomi finally lifted her head, tilting it slightly as she studied him. And then, she smiled. Not big, not forced, just a small, knowing smile. "Oh," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm exactly where I need to be." For the first time that night, Lucas's expression flickered. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there. A shift, a crack in his confidence. Naomi saw it, and she knew he saw it too. "Good," Lucas scoffed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must not realize where you are." Naomi just held his gaze. Steady, unshaken. And that was the problem for him, wasn't it? She wasn't begging. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted. Lucas stepped closer to the bars, lowering his voice. "You think you're special just 'cause you wear a uniform?" Naomi let out a slow breath, barely shaking her head. "No." Her voice was calm. "I think I'm special because I know how this ends." Lucas's smirk tightened. His jaw flexed. For the first time, he didn't have a response. She could see his mind working, trying to figure out what she meant, trying to convince himself he was still in control. But deep down, he was starting to doubt. And that meant Naomi had already won the first round. Lucas scoffed again, pushing off the bars. "Sleep well, Lieutenant." Naomi watched as he walked away, his shoulders squared, his boots thudding against the tile like he owned the world. He still thought he was winning. But Naomi wasn't worried, because she knew his world was about to come crashing down. The holding cell was silent, save for the occasional distant murmur of officers at the front desk. Naomi remained seated on the metal bench, her back straight, her hands resting loosely on her lap. She had slept in war zones, in barracks during emergency drills, and on steel decks of naval ships during deployments. A cold, dimly lit cell wasn't going to shake her, and yet, she could feel something shifting in the air. Something was coming. She closed her eyes briefly, listening. The rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere in the station. The distant shuffle of paperwork. The low, buzzing voices of officers exchanging idle conversation. Then, footsteps. Fast, hesitant. Not the usual, slow, heavy boots of someone who thought they had control. No, this was different. Naomi didn't move, didn't react as she heard someone approach Sergeant Lucas Hayes. A voice, young, unsure. "Sergeant Hayes, there's been a call." Lucas barely glanced up from the station's computer, still as smug as ever. "Then answer it," he muttered, not bothering to give the officer his full attention. The young officer hesitated. "It's from a Navy legal representative." Silence. Lucas froze mid-typing. Naomi smiled to herself. She didn't need to see his face to know that the first crack had formed. She imagined him, brows furrowing, jaw tightening, that smug little smirk slipping ever so slightly. Lucas slowly turned his head toward the young officer. "What?" The rookie officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the phone in his hand. "They're asking about a Lieutenant Commander Naomi Carter," he said, clearing his throat. "They want to know why she was detained." The words landed like a punch. Lucas sat back in his chair, trying to mask the sudden tension in his shoulders. Naomi lifted her head slightly, tilting her ear to listen more closely. Here we go. Lucas waved a dismissive hand. Tell them I'll call back when I'm done with my shift. But the rookie officer didn't move. Sir, he swallowed. I don't think that's a good idea. Lucas finally turned in his chair, now fully paying attention. The young officer shifted again. They're saying this is urgent. Lucas's jaw clenched. His gaze flickered toward the front desk where a few officers had started listening in. He wasn't used to this. He was the one who made people uncomfortable, not the other way around. Still, he forced a smirk, leaning back lazily. Fine, patch it through. The rookie officer nodded quickly and placed the call on speaker. The second the line connected, a voice rang out, sharp, professional, authoritative. This is Commander Richard Wallace, legal counsel for the United States Navy. Lucas blinked. Naomi's lawyer was a Navy officer? His fingers twitched slightly against the desk, but he kept his voice smooth. Sergeant Hayes, what can I do for you? There was a pause. Then, you can explain why one of our decorated officers is sitting in your holding cell. A few officers in the background exchanged glances. Naomi allowed herself the smallest, most satisfied smirk. There it is. The moment he realizes he messed up, Lucas cleared his throat, his confidence wavering, just a little. She was uncooperative during a routine traffic stop, he replied, trying to keep control of the narrative. The voice on the other end remained calm. Too calm. Uncooperative. Wallace repeated, That's interesting, because we've already reviewed the bodycam footage. Lucas's smirk vanished. Excuse me. We have a copy of the footage, Sergeant, and it paints a very different picture than the one you're telling. The entire station seemed to hold its breath. Before Lucas could respond, another officer's phone rang. A second later, a different desk sergeant answered another call. One by one, the station buzzed to life. More calls, more voices. The Navy, the mayor's office, internal affairs. Lucas turned in his seat, his fingers curling into fists. Naomi lifted her chin slightly, watching through the bars as Lucas Hayes' entire world started to close in on him. Lucas leaned forward, lowering his voice. Commander Wallace, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding, Wallace cut in. This isn't the first complaint that's been filed against you, Sergeant Hayes. Lucas's lips pressed into a thin line. We've already contacted internal affairs. I suggest you start explaining yourself. Lucas's throat bobbed as he swallowed. The confidence? Gone. The arrogance? Evaporated. Naomi's eyes met his through the bars. And for the first time, she saw fear. Not of her, not of the Navy, but of the consequences. And just like that, the shift was complete. Lucas Hayes was no longer the one with control. The morning sun spilled through the towering glass windows of the Dallas County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the marble floors. Naomi Carter walked through the entrance, not as a prisoner, not as a defendant, but as a fighter. No handcuffs, no chains, just confidence. She had spent the last 12 hours in a cell, waiting for this moment. And now she was ready to watch Sergeant Lucas Hayes fall. The courtroom was already half full by the time she arrived. Journalists lined the back, whispering to each other, their notebooks and cameras ready. To the left, a group of uniformed officers sat, some staring straight ahead, others avoiding her gaze altogether. And then, there he was, Lucas Hayes. He sat stiffly at the defense table, his shoulders squared, but there was something different now. His usual arrogance? Missing. His forced confidence? Cracked. He was trying to hold it together, but Naomi saw what was lurking underneath. Doubt. Fear. Good. Naomi took her seat beside her lawyer, Charles Whitman, a man with a reputation for dismantling opponents in court. He was known for being ruthless, for knowing exactly where to strike, and for never losing. This case, it was a gift. As he flipped through a thick folder of documents, he leaned slightly toward Naomi. You ready? He asked, his voice low. Naomi's eyes never left Lucas as she responded. More than ready. Whitman smirked. Good, because today we bury him. A wooden door swung open, and the bailiff's voice rang out. All rise for the Honorable Judge Evelyn Harper. The room stood as the judge entered. A woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed, uninterested in nonsense. She settled into her seat, adjusted her glasses, and glanced at the files before her. Then she looked up. Let's get to it. No pleasantries. No delays. Straight to business. Lucas shifted in his seat. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with neatly combed hair and a crisp gray suit, rose from his chair and adjusted his tie. He looked straight at Lucas, then back at the judge. "Your Honor, what we have here is not just an unlawful arrest. It's a pattern of misconduct." He turned, lifting a stack of documents from the table. "And we have the evidence to prove it." Lucas sat stone-faced, but Naomi saw the way his fingers twitched. He knew what was coming. The prosecutor walked to the center of the room, standing before the jury. "First, let's examine the bodycam footage from the night in question." A large screen lowered at the front of the courtroom. The lights dimmed slightly, and then it played. Naomi watched as her own arrest played back in front of a silent courtroom. Lucas's voice filled the air, sharp, aggressive. His movements, calculated, intentional. She watched as he snatched her wrist without warning, twisting it behind her back. She saw the way he tightened cuffs on purpose. Then the final nail in the coffin, his smug remark as he shoved her into the patrol car. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing." The entire courtroom sat frozen. Judge Harper's expression didn't change, but Naomi could see it in her eyes. She had already made up her mind. The prosecutor didn't pause. He moved immediately to the next piece of evidence. "Now, let's look at Sergeant Hayes' history." A new file appeared on the screen, one filled with numbers. Cold, damning numbers. Sergeant Hayes has conducted 82% of his traffic stops on black drivers, despite only 24% of the local population being black. A murmur rippled through the room. Lucas stiffened. Additionally, the prosecutor continued, he has issued citations and arrests at a rate 5 times higher for black individuals than white drivers. The numbers didn't lie. The pattern was undeniable, and Lucas knew it. The defense attorney stood, adjusting his jacket. He cleared his throat, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, my client was following standard police procedure." The defendant. Judge Harper cut in, lifting an eyebrow. Lucas's attorney swallowed. He had already lost control of the narrative. The judge turned back to Lucas. "Sergeant Hayes, do you have an explanation for these numbers?" Lucas opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. The judge sighed, rubbing her temple. "I don't like what I'm seeing here, Sergeant." Judge Harper turned toward Naomi. "Lieutenant Commander Carter, you are free to go. This arrest should never have happened." The gavel came down. Sharp. Final. Naomi exhaled slowly. She had never doubted how this would end. Lucas, on the other hand, he looked like he had just been punched in the gut, and he wasn't done falling yet. Because as soon as the hearing ended, another voice rang out in the courtroom. "Sergeant Hayes, a moment please." Lucas turned, only to see 2 officers from Internal Affairs waiting for him. One held a folder filled with files. The other, a pair of handcuffs. Naomi stood as Lucas finally understood. His career, over. His power, gone. He had thought his badge made him untouchable. He was wrong, and Naomi Carter had just proven it. The air in the station felt different when Lucas Hayes walked through the doors the next morning. For the first time in his career, he wasn't in control. The usual nods of respect from fellow officers, gone. The quiet acknowledgement of his authority, non-existent. Instead, he felt the weight of stares from behind desks, from break rooms, from officers pretending to work while sneaking glances his way. The entire department had heard what happened, and more importantly, they had seen the footage. Lucas walked past a group of rookies near the lockers. He heard the whispers, the barely concealed murmurs. "That's him. I saw the video. He's done for." His jaw clenched, his fingers curling into fists. The tension only grew worse when he entered his office, throwing his bag onto the desk. He barely had time to sit before the door swung open. 2 men in gray suits stepped inside. Internal Affairs. Lucas forced himself to stay calm. "Can I help you?" he asked, leaning back, forcing a smirk. The taller officer, Detective Raymond Clark, folded his arms. "Sergeant Hayes, we need to have a conversation about your recent arrest." Lucas rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. That woman was..." Clark held up a thick manila folder and dropped it onto Lucas's desk. It landed with a heavy thud. Too heavy for just one case file. Lucas frowned. "What's that?" The second IA officer, Detective Michael Torres, pulled out a sheet of paper and slid it toward him. Lucas's own arrest records. Not just Naomi Carter's case, all of them. The ones he thought were buried. The ones that Internal Affairs had now reopened. Lucas's throat went dry. "You've been flagged for racial profiling," Clark stated. Lucas laughed dryly, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." Torres didn't blink. "It's not ridiculous when we have years of data proving a pattern." Lucas leaned forward, gripping the edge of his desk. "So what? I pull over who I pull over. You gonna fire me for doing my job?" Clark's eyes narrowed. "That's the thing, Hayes. It wasn't your job to harass people." A tense silence stretched between them, and then Torres delivered the final blow. "As of this moment, you're on unpaid suspension, pending termination." The words hit Lucas like a gut punch. Hours later, Lucas found himself standing outside the chief of police's office, arms crossed. He had tried to fight back, tried to argue, tried to claim he was being unfairly targeted. None of it mattered. When the door finally opened, Chief Robert Callahan barely looked up. Lucas stepped inside. "Sir, this is—" The chief cut him off with a sharp glare. "Close the door." Lucas obeyed, though his jaw tightened. Chief Callahan leaned back in his chair, hands folded, studying Lucas with an expression of pure disappointment. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "You embarrassed this department," Callahan said, his voice even. Lucas swallowed. "Sir, with all due respect, no, you don't get to talk." The chief's voice was cold, controlled, deadly. Lucas felt the weight of those words. He had been on the force for over 15 years. And now, it was all crashing down. Callahan sighed, rubbing his forehead. "We had your back, Hayes. We looked the other way more times than we should have." Lucas's stomach twisted. "Sir, pack your things." The words hit harder than any punch. Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. This wasn't a suspension anymore. This was the end. He tried to leave quietly. He didn't want to see the faces of the people who had once respected him. But the moment he stepped out of the office, it was clear. There was no quiet way to go. Officers stopped what they were doing. Some stared. Some pretended not to notice, as if they hadn't been talking about him all morning. Lucas kept walking. He pushed open the locker room doors and grabbed his things, stuffing them into his bag with aggressive movements. His badge lay on the bench, beside him. The same badge that once made him feel untouchable. Now, it felt worthless. He picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. Then, he dropped it. The metal clattered against the bench, forgotten. Lucas slung his bag over his shoulder, squared his jaw, and walked out. And for the first time, no one stopped him. No nods, no goodbyes, just silence. He had spent his career wielding power over others. But today, he had none. The soft clinking of ceramic cups and the low hum of conversation filled the air as Naomi Carter sat near the window of a quiet downtown cafe. Her fingers curled around the warm coffee cup, its steam rising lazily in front of her. She should have been relaxed. She should have felt relieved. She had won. Lucas Hayes had lost. But as she scrolled through the headlines flashing across her phone screen, she felt something else entirely. Sergeant Hayes fired after unlawful arrest. Naval officer fights back against corrupt cop. Justice served. A corrupt officer taken down. Naomi exhaled, setting her phone face down on the table. The world was already moving on. People would read these headlines, shake their heads, maybe share an article or comment on social media. And then, they'd forget. Her coffee sat untouched as she leaned back in her chair, watching the city move outside the window. People walked past in a hurry. Cars honked in the distance. Life continued. For her, it was over. For Lucas Hayes, it was over. But for how many others? How many names had never made it into the headlines? How many people had sat in that same cold holding cell, but never got the calls from lawyers, never had a high-ranking officer to fight for them? How many people had been silenced, forgotten, left to deal with the damage alone? She had won her battle, but the war, that was far from over. Her phone buzzed against the table, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. Captain Eric Donovan. She sighed before answering. Lieutenant Commander Carter. The familiar voice came through, steady and professional. "Naomi, I assume you've seen the news." She let out a dry chuckle. "Hard to miss." A pause. Then, "The Department of Defense wants to recognize you for handling this with professionalism and grace." Naomi closed her eyes briefly. Recognition. Awards. Speeches. They wanted to make her a symbol. But she hadn't fought this battle for a medal. She had fought it because she had to. Because too many people before her hadn't gotten the chance. She opened her eyes again, watching as a group of people passed by outside. A mother walked hand in hand with her young son, a black boy, no older than 7 or 8, laughing at something his mother said. His eyes were bright, his face full of joy, untouched by the reality of what he would one day face. Naomi watched them disappear down the sidewalk. Then she spoke. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I don't need recognition." A pause. "Then what do you need?" Donovan asked. Naomi's fingers tapped lightly against her coffee cup. Then quietly, "I need people to stop thinking this fight is over." She stepped outside a few minutes later, inhaling the crisp afternoon air. The city felt different today, though she knew it wasn't. She had changed. She had seen the system for what it was, up close, personal. And she knew the truth. This fight, it wasn't just hers. It never was. She had fought for herself, yes, but also for that little boy she had seen on the sidewalk. For every black child who deserved to grow up in a world where men like Lucas Hayes couldn't wield their badges like weapons. For every person who had ever been in that cell, but had no voice loud enough to demand justice. She took a deep breath. Then, slowly she smiled. Because today was a win. But tomorrow, the fight continued. Her voice echoed in her own mind, a mantra she had learned the hard way. Unchecked power is abused power. Change starts with speaking up. And Naomi Carter? She would never stay silent. The screen fades to black, the echoes of Naomi's footsteps still lingering in the audience's mind. Then, the narrator's voice cuts through the silence, calm, steady, and undeniable. This isn't just a story. This is reality. A slow montage appears, clips of real headlines, real cases, real people who never got the justice Naomi did. Unchecked power is abused power, and when no one speaks up, it only grows stronger. A pause, letting the weight of the words settle. Then, a direct challenge. If this story made you think, share it. The screen flashes images of people standing together. Protests, courtroom battles, communities refusing to stay silent. If it made you angry, talk about it. More headlines appear, ones that haven't yet seen justice. Names of people wrongfully arrested, lives torn apart. Because real change starts with real conversations. The music swells, subtle but powerful, as the final image fades in. A single hand reaching out, gripping another. A symbol of unity, of resistance, of hope. And then, the last words, bold and unshakable. Speak up, stand up, never stay silent. The screen fades to black. Then, the final words appear. Justice is a choice. What will you choose? The video ends.